A very pleasant good day to all of our viewers. We welcome you to another edition of Let's Talk. We're delighted that you have chosen to join us, and we are excited about what we're going to be discussing this Let's Talk issue. I said excited because it's information that we're eager to share. But it's also disturbing to some respects. You will discover why in a moment. We have been for the last few weeks discussing the subject masking abuse, hurt, infidelity, and unfaithfulness behind the cloak of the church. This, of course, is a very serious subject. We have spent 2 weeks thus far exploring various dimensions of this. And today we are dealing specifically with the issue of children and abuse. And that is why I'm saying in some respects, the information is frightening, it's disturbing, but it is something that needs to be discussed, needs to be spoken of. And today we have again our Family Ministries Director, Pastor Stanton Adams, with us. And we are going to be sharing. We have lots of information to share with you. We are confident that we will be back next week because we will not complete what we want to talk about, this very important aspect of this discussion. Before we go to Pastor Adams, we invite you to have a word of prayer with us. Eternal Father and our God, we thank you for the opportunity and privilege to share with our friends in Radio Lands, those listening via Second Advent Radio, and those who are joining us via our various social media platforms. We ask that as we discuss this very important subject today, that you will guide in our deliberations. And for those who listen, oh God, we pray that you will give them a sense of the seriousness of this subject, and may they pledge to do what they can to pass on information and to implement the principles that we will share. Thank you for hearing and answering in Jesus' name. Amen. Pastor Adams, we are dealing with something very profound, very important. We're going to take our time today.
Well, good afternoon again to those who are looking at us on this very important and informative program, Let's Talk. And we are delighted to share with you in this very critical area, crucial area that we have not spoken to, but as Dr. Greene rightly said, disturbing, but somebody has to deal with the elephant in the room. And it is so necessary because we are talking to the church and well, the wider community, but our focus is on the church and some of these realities that we are not addressing. So we have to talk to this, and we trust that you will not just listen by yourself or view by yourself, but call somebody and let them be tuned in to next Let's Talk. And very important subject matter we are talking to today.
Well, Pastor, we want to redeem every minute of the time we have this afternoon because, like I said, we are focusing on child abuse. And that is a subject that is heavy, that is involved, and one that all of our viewers need to give attention to. Now, recently, I shouldn't probably say recently, over the last 15 or so years, a lot of attention has been given to the issues coming out of the Roman Catholic Church with the priests abusing young boys. And I think at that time, when that issue arose, it really was something that kind of shocked the world. And so lots of people have researched it, have looked into various dimensions of this priests abusing young children, particularly boys in the church. But not much attention have been given to abuse outside of the Catholic Church, Protestantism. And so I want to focus a little bit, just to begin the discussion, focus a little bit on what is going on in the Protestant field. For those of you who are not familiar with the term Protestantism, we're talking about Christian churches other than the Catholic Church. So we're talking about Baptists and Pentecostals and Seventh-day Adventists and Anglicans and Methodists and the whole range of Christian denominations. Now, I'm going to share a quotation from the Journal of Qualitative Criminal Justice and Criminology. And it's an article that was published in 2023, January 2, to be specific. That's just about 2 years ago. I read, it says, some estimates exist on the total instances of sexual abuse within Protestant Christian churches. One estimate comes from 3 of the largest faith-based insurance companies defined that insure some 160,000 churches. These 3 faith-based insurance companies reported 7,095 insurance claims of sexual abuse by clerical members, church employees, congregational members, or others involved within these settings from 1987 to 2007. Now, these reports indicate that an average of 260 claims of sexual abuse per year. So we are seeing here that this issue is not confined to the Catholic Church. It's an issue that is plaguing the Christian community. So the issue of child abuse in the Catholic Church, as I said before, has caused a lot of people to focus their attention on that church, but not on the Protestant churches in general. My question to you, Pastor, is what is it about churches that make this issue of child abuse so persistent?
That is so very, very crucial. What happens within the context of the church, and you see, I am glad that you did raise this. The church have the potential, as we look at it, the church has the, and quoting me, the church has the potential because of that conducive environment. What is that conducive environment? People operate there in the context of the church in a position of power and control and authority. And we can say the specific areas. And so apart from the power and control and authority that people really have, we have a culture of niceness. You know, this culture of niceness where we are supposed to be of one body, one fellowship,
trust in one another,
being kind to one another. And while we are doing that, boundaries, and we can get off limit, and I'm going to get back to that as we continue. And the culture of niceness is number one. And then, you know, that is promoted in the religious setting, the culture of niceness across denomination, because we talk about fellowship and we are all together, we are one, and just sheer numbers and interaction with youth, young people. Just the sheer numbers of interacting. A number of Protestant denominations would have youth groups, youth functions, youth programs, and we know a number of them. And so people interact with these young congregants, if I want to use that term, or parishioners in various settings. It could be a weekly, it could be monthly and daily. So what are the things that we have? We have church services, we have some of the basic things, like we have mission trips, we have choir practice, we have youth groups, we have camps, we have mission trips. So all of this allows for a constant interaction, sometimes weekly, monthly interaction. And people can use these occasions to gain access to young people, yea, children, to carry out these things. So the positional power within the organization itself put people in that position of authority and control and trust while we have all of these activities. And so this constant interaction here can lead to many opportunities for abuse within that setting, you see.
Before you go on, Pastor, because you use a word there that I just want to follow up on. Because some people believe, and perhaps correctly so, that a real issue with child sexual abuse is not so much sex, but it is a matter of authority. you know, and control individuals who, because of their positions of power, are able to use that position of power and authority for their own benefits.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. Their own nefarious benefits, and that is really unfortunate.
Yes. And so you have, because of the privilege and the opportunity, because of the authority and the position that you occupy, whether you are a pastor or a youth leader or a deacon or whoever, a choir director, whatever, because all of these are the areas. Because remember, I said they are weekly, daily, sometimes monthly interactions, right? And so it is amazing that you have these offenders. You have on-site offenders and off-site offenders. On-site offenders meaning that these sexual abuses and offenses are carried on in the campus, the church plant, the church campus where the function is taking place. So you come to a church for maybe a choir rehearsal or for whatever practice session about something. So, and it's alarming that about 73.8% of these offenses are on-site offenses, and about 26.2% what we call off-site offenders. And these offenses are related to the on-site conduct. So meaning that the person who has begun the abusive behavior on the on-site situation also will abuse the victims off-site. The off-site offenders, there's a connection. So somebody might abuse somebody in their charge on the church's plant, but they go to a camp or a picnic or some trip, and that abuser uses that opportunity to further abuse the victims. Because I will tell you that there are several types of offenders that continually abuse. So it's not just a one shot. Because there's the opportunistic abuser where the opportunity presents itself and the person abuses the victim. But there's another type of offender where the person can be considered a serial abuser that includes multiple victims.
I was going to say before you go into the types, and that's important. But I suspect that there are some folks who are listening now who may be quite alarmed to hear that we're talking about sexual abuse, and particularly of children, in a Christian context, in Christian churches. And our topic is the whole matter of masking this behavior behind the cloak of the church.
Yes.
And as you said, the church appears to be a safe place. There are lots of people.
We have the niceness culture.
Yes.
Right.
You know, we are to trust one another. We call one another brothers and sisters, and you know, you teach children to be respectful to their elders, etc. So that when now these individuals gain the confidence of those within their care, here we're talking about the abuse of power and authority again, and so this does happen. So to those who are listening, it is a real issue. It's a serious problem, and that is why we are discussing this, because we want you to be mindful. We want you to be aware. We have a lot to cover, so let's get back to the discussion.
Yes, and I just want to give some practical examples, because you should read because you quoted from a particular article, and they have cited some of these cases where the actual assault, abuse took place. The on-site offender abused the victim at the church on the physical plant. There was a case where this person was the church's musician. I think that case was in Australia. This was a 45-year-old who sexually abused a 13-year-old boy, sodomized a 13-year-old boy in the church's basement. That's not a that's an on-site abuser.
And we're going to talk about a lot more because, well, I don't want to run ahead of myself.
Yes.
So in order to provide context when we say sexual abuse, let's clarify a few terms so that our listeners are clear on what we're talking about. Sexual abuse has many forms. So what do we really mean by sexual abuse? It includes things like, and I'll ask you to expand, but things like engaging in sexual activity in front of a child, showing a child sexually explicit videos and images, etc. And there's several others. But can you just expand on some aspects? Because a lot of people believe that sexual abuse is only when somebody engages in physical sexual activity with a child. But there's a lot to sexual abuse.
Yes.
So can you just run through?
Yes. Sexual abuse is any act of behavior that is perpetrated on an individual without their consent, including all of those that you mentioned. And there's another one you need to add there, where physical exposure of the genitals to a child or a minor or somebody who is
Well, I actually didn't go through a list, because I showed two, but you have interactions of sexually explicit images. You know, that's an important one. Likewise, showing individuals these days with technology and cell phones. That's important. Soliciting the images, touching, groping, fondling, sexual contact of any kind.
Yes, kissing.
Yes.
Right, any of those. And it can be the fondling of an individual beneath the clothing or outside of the clothing. But the bottom line is without the person's consent. And what makes it even more dangerous if the victim resists any form of advance. In fact, you know that it is sexual abuse because of many reasons, and I'll mention them. If the victim resists, if the victim explicitly communicates their disagreement, that they don't want, if the victim is a minor or a child, if the victim lacks understanding, of the consequences as to what will result, if the victim is mentally or physically incapacitated, all of those are the ranges. And when you read in law, because then we have to do, while we do family life, we have to do family law and public policy. And the policy that has to do with sexuality within the family, because you have in the context of the family, I'm going back, you may have a church person who abuses, who sexually molests not only their own offspring, blood offspring, but that person may abuse other family members. So an uncle may abuse nieces or nephews, other family members.
I mean, if we get time, we will talk about how the abuser looks. That's important.
Yes.
Because, again, there are lots of misconceptions out there. But you mentioned an individual who is incapacitated mentally, physically, and people may be saying, why would somebody want to sexually abuse an individual who has a physical challenge or mental challenge? But the reality is these things happen all the time.
Yes. And I will say something about that person, that person. So if people think that is unthinkable, that's why I was talking to you about I was hinting about the various typologies of these abusers. The type of person that will abuse somebody who is incapacitated, who has those kind of things, is one who is considered naive. That is a naive, inadequate molester. And that naive, inadequate molester, they have difficulty with adult relationships. And more than that, they have a cognitive disorder. So it's not a normal person. That person who will do something like that, who would perpetrate that type of sexual abuse or assault on somebody, a child, a minor, who is incapacitated, or who has any physical limitation, that person is the naive, inadequate molester. In other words, they can sexually molest somebody like that without showing any remorse or understanding of what they have done.
As you're raising the issue here, talking about pedophiles and the categorization of pedophiles, it is an important point you're making there about the mental challenges that some of these people have. And we, I suppose, need to understand that when an individual sees a young child, a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, and feels so strongly drawn to that individual, to want to have sexual relations with that individual, that's a mental challenge right there. And individuals must understand that some of these individuals do need the help. It's not just saying, hey, stop doing that. It's a lot more.
But apart from that naive, inadequate molester, as you raised that, there is the one that is called the preferential child molester. These just have a sexual preference for children. They just have a sexual preference for children, and they are not mere opportunistic abusers. And under the preferential, these preferential child molesters, there are several subtypes. Like this seductive, the seductive molester. And the seductive molester, those are the ones who will engage in a process of grooming the victim, to earn the victim's trust.
And they do take
and affection.
Time. They do take time. They're very patient.
They take time. They can take a long time. They may also enter the child life, the seductive person, in the world of play, because children are drawn in the world of play. And there was a case, and police in law enforcement in North America, not like us, they have a way of following. And this child would go to this play field and play, and the molester drew the child away through the world of play, and he was not just an seductive, because there can be a combination. He was a sadistic molester, because the sadistic molester he would use physical force, violence, even kill the victim. That's the sadist. When somebody is a sadist, you have this sadistic type of molester.
Maybe, Pastor,
child molester.
Maybe I should raise the issue now, because for those of you who are listening and you follow things like athletics, the Olympics, etc. You may have heard of the case with the coach who molested these gymnasts.
Yes, these girls.
And people would hardly look at a gentleman, a well-respected gentleman, like this. Now, this is in the area of athletics, right? But that individual may also have been a member of a church.
Yes.
And goes to church regularly, and nobody suspects what is happening.
Right.
And because people may even have said, well, he takes care of all these girls, he's a respectable man, so maybe he's good to work with the children.
Yeah.
And right away, he says, well, this is another
opportunistic thing. And I'm glad you raised that, but even though we will come back directly to the church, but I follow that case because I being an athlete myself, and you would have noticed what the judge said when he was sentenced. He was not just sentencing alone, but he also had to get clinical attention.
Exactly.
Yes, he also had to get clinical attention.
Well, let's continue with our definition. So we spoke about sexual abuse and the range of things that we mean when we talk about sexual abuse. There's a term you used in response to sexual abuse. You said that sexual abuse happens when an adult, an individual in a position of authority exercises his or her authority to engage children without their consent. And I want to go back to this word consent. In many cases, the determinant issue is whether or not a person is able to give consent. So how do we define consent? And I know from country to country, it may be a little different. But how do we define consent?
Exactly. Consent, as you rightly said, would vary based on jurisdictions. But for example, Central America and the Caribbean, where we live and reside, the age of consent is between 13 to 18, with Cuba being an exception. That if the person is below the age of 16, there is the person who will give consent to cannot be more than a particular number of age above that person, ranging from 2 to 5 years. Right. But when we talk about consent, we are talking about a free, voluntary, informed. Notice what? Free, voluntary, informed decision the person is making to participate in any sexual act. So it is a free, voluntary, informed. So the consent has to be free and clearly communicated. Not just free, but it has to be clearly communicated, meaning that the individual cannot be intoxicated on any substance, where their mental state is not normal. You see, so if the person is maybe drugged or even on medication, because there are some medication that could affect your reasoning and your ability to think and make rational decisions, right? So, so the person cannot be asleep or unconscious. They have to make a rational decision, and that is very, very crucial. You see, and so it cannot be incapacitated. They cannot be on drug or under the influence of alcohol, and they must be able to clearly communicate that consent that is mutual.
I think there's another element that I want us to just state, because it's also important, because people mature at different levels, but irrespective of whether a person has reasonability and may tell you they know what they're doing and they're giving consent, if that person is a minor and the law says, for example, if the law says 16 is the age of consent,
I was
and that individual is 15, that individual cannot give consent.
Right. I was going to that. So in the most jurisdiction, the age of consent is 16. If the person is below 16, like 14 or 15 or so, that person can give consent. But the person who they will make this consent with has to be less than 5 years older. The person has to be less than 5 years older.
Depending on the jurisdiction.
Also depending on the jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, but the point I was making, Pastor.
In Antigua, consent is 16. Yes. In Guyana, consent is 16 as well.
So the point I was making, and I want people not to miss this one because it is important. The fact that a person says, yes, this is what I want, the individual in the position of authority must realize and appreciate that I have a position of authority. And the fact that a person says, yes, I understand and this is what I want, doesn't necessarily make it right. And may not even qualify as consent, given the age versus the individual.
The age, because you're on not just the age, but the position of authority that you're in. And that also goes for people like us in the clinical setting who have power. A clinician has power and authority, right? And you cannot use your position. So let's say a clergyman is a counselor, because some clergymen are not just trained theologically, they may also be trained to counsel. In fact, in the setting, and I'm glad that you went there, because I missed that in the first question that you asked. Because you see, the law would they don't scrutinize the religious organization, so a clergyman can counsel without having a clinical license to practice in a professional setting.
We say pastoral counseling.
So pastoral counseling, so you have that authority to do that, and people trust you to do that, right? And in those settings, these situations can occur as well.
Yes, and because that is a clear position of authority.
Yes. Yes.
Well, let's talk about another term. In fact, two terms. What's the difference between sexual misconduct and sexual abuse?
Well, yeah, sexual misconduct. Any sexual behavior that is meted out to a person without their consent, any form, and underline the word any, right? Any form of sexual act or behavior that a person does not consent to. And again, I want to say that includes touching inappropriately, kissing the person, unwanted oral sex, all of those, right? And but when we look at sexual abuse now, that is a pattern of coercive sexual assault, and that includes violence, like rape, trafficking, coercion. That's the abuse. Notice the definition, because when we talk about intimate violence, even though we are not talking about that, but the same word is used in the definition, a pattern.
Yes.
A pattern of persistent sexual assault, coercion, rape, all of those are involved. The trafficking of the victim, all of those things are involved.
And I think it is important that individuals who lead and relate to children must understand that even their speech, you have to consider whether what you're saying is appropriate to the age group that you're speaking to or with.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, I've even known, for individuals who are above the age of consent, we can speak to the matter of ethics, and say, why would you use, for example, in a sermon, a particular illustration that becomes so graphic that makes people uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. So that is about exercising one's responsibility and ethical behavior.
Yes, sure.
But let's get back to our discussion about sexual misconduct, sexual abuse, specifically as it relates to children. I want to share one more quote, in fact. Mm-hmm. This one is from an online source, Brave and Hearts. Mm-hmm. It is an Australian child protection not-for-profit organization solely dedicated to the prevention and the treatment of child sexual abuse. And here's a quote. It says, survivors, and I should just provide some context, they did some research with several, in fact, 6,875 survivors of sexual abuse, and wanted to find out how long did they take before they reported. And the quote says, survivors took on average 23.9 years. 23.9 years to tell someone they had been sexually abused. Now, that is interesting. So if a person, on average, of the 6,875 persons they interviewed, on average, they discovered that it took people 23.9, almost 24 years before they felt strong enough to say something. What do we make of this, Pastor? Mm-hmm.
You see, again, because of there are some fears that are associated. Well, when people have experienced that type of trauma, because of the culture that we have developed, people are afraid to report such cases because the number one fear, then the sense that they will not be believed. If you report a religious leader, is that really so? Not him, not that clergyman, not that elder. You're making this up. That's not the truth. You see, so the culture, the fear, and then more than that, we have this conspiracy I think sometime we were talking before. I think I'm trying to remember. I really believe that it was on the same Let's Talk. The conspiracy of silence that exists within the religious denominational organizations, right? Where this thing is hush-hush and covered, but when the person have grown and have gotten their freedom, as we see in many of the cases, because you see those people who are reporting now, they are now grown people. They did not report the issue while they were still minors. They reported when they became, and most of those reported are those who have, when we want to say, apostatized or left the religious organization. So some of the apostasy that we have seen, as I look at the literature, is associated with these experiences where people do no longer trust their spiritual leaders, nor no longer trust the religious community or organization, because, as I already said, they were not believed, or they have the idea that they would not be believed, and all of that. And so you would notice from the literature that these people who are now in their adult years when they reported. In fact, there was a case recently where it ended up, it is alleged that this person was abused, and now this person is now an adult and was so enraged that they actually killed the perpetrator. That was months ago or so in my country.
So to our viewers and our listeners, we are talking about something that is extremely significant, important. Pastor James just made, I said Pastor
Adams.
Pastor Adams, just made reference to the fact that some of these individuals who now in their adult life have given up on God,
religion,
have left the church because when they were younger, when the abuse did take place, they were not believed. And some persons did not report.
And somebody did not report because of the fears.
And let me share a case that I encountered. Some persons did not report because somebody else did. And the treatment the other person got caused this particular individual to say, if I report it, there's the same thing's going to happen to me. And so it's better off that I keep silent. I mean, I've had individuals who told me, I spoke to a young lady once, she said, Pastor, I tried to commit suicide. And she showed me where she caught herself, because at the time the thing happened, somebody else had reported it, had reported an incident that took place with them. And the brethren, quote unquote, said she was lying, she was trying to destroy the man's family, etc. What we're saying is that this is reason enough. Let me rephrase that. The trauma that people have to deal with. And you know what is so difficult? When you don't report it, but if it's a church setting, and you have to go every Saturday or Sunday or whenever you have church and sit down and watch the perpetrator preach and share, and deep down in your heart, you know what is happening, and also know that all these folks around you will not believe you if you speak. That is difficult to explain, the emotional turmoil in that individual's life.
Yes,
and some of these individuals, when they reach the age to make their own decisions, they turn away from God.
Yes, the person can be re-traumatized again, just coming in the presence of this person who have done this harm. It is harm, not just harm, but I want to make this strong, because I'm talking because of the church. It is satanic. Abuse is always satanic. Power and control, and anyone who will cause pain to any of God's creation, abuse is satanic. That is what the quotation from my favorite writer, one of my favorite writer, Ellen White, said that any disposition to cause pain to any of God's creation, including the brute creation, is satanic, and a record goes up to heaven. And as it has to do with molestation of children, the scripture is strong because we're talking to the religious community now. Christ said, if you offend any of these little ones, it is better for a millstone be hung around your neck and you be cast into the sea. Strong, right. Serious language. That is to show that is not. And notice that a lot of his object lessons and kingdom principles, children were the subject. How he took children, so he showed in his life and teaching his love for children, and as we in the culture in which we live, why that is happening, and children, when we are growing up, children must be seen and not heard. But I want to say in this religious community in which we are on, and beyond the religious community, children must be seen and not be hurt. Children must be seen and not be hurt. And because, as you rightly said, these traumas, if not fixed, because you have to get clinical help for that. And I want to make to give to our listening audience, viewers, some pointers to say, because remember he said a lot of time the child will not be believed, and then you have the re-victimization of the victim because of what the victim has seen been meted out to somebody else who has reported, and all again, the victim, the person is the victim, the perpetrator goes scot-free, but that victim, because of how you respond to what he or she is reporting, the victim is re-victimized again.
Well, maybe we should deal with it now. We have about 15 minutes to wrap this thing up. And we're going to continue next week because it's an important discussion.
I want to give some pointers to say why the victim must be believed.
Let's slow it down a little bit, Pastor. Now I can see the passion, yes. but let's slow it down a little bit because I want to make this point. There's a tendency, especially, and I want to say this as forcefully as I can, especially if it is your spouse who is being accused, or your son or your daughter who is being accused. There is this tendency to get on the defensive and to say the child is lying. So I want you to begin, Pastor Adams, by talking to the issue of why it is important not to brush away an individual who musters the courage to say, listen, something inappropriate happened to me and I want to share it with you. Why is it important that we don't give the child the impression that he or she is a nuisance, that they must not be believed, etc.? Start with that.
Yeah. Children do not make these things up. Because if you read the literature, all of those clinicians, child psychologists who deal with these cases, they say that you must believe the child until proven otherwise, because children do not make up those kind of stories. They don't make up those kind of stories. When and if it becomes a legal matter, and we're saying that because of the conspiracy of silence and the victim not being believed, and we protect that perpetrator, a lot of times these criminal activity, and it is a criminal activity, whether it is outside there in secular society or in the church, it is not just abuse as it is a criminal activity. And so they are, as you have said in our opening, that there are litigation that were brought against the church because of this. So you have to believe the victim, right? And then again, to protect the family and the family image, family secrets, and so, and when the family that is in a state of dysfunction, disequilibrium, that is in what we call a state of enmeshment, those things happen where you don't believe the report, the child, right? Because in those family types, the boundaries are not, there's no permeableness when the boundaries are supposed to be so that somebody could get out of that system and get help, the prerequisite help. If it is a closed system there, enmeshment to that point, then you are going to bring disgrace and whatever on this family. And so if this gets out, so we want to deal with it in this context here. So, we're going to kill it at its beginning. And one of the ways to do that is to act and pretend to shut the victim up. We don't believe the story, don't even repeat it again. And sometimes we may see, or we might not be aware of the symptoms that the victim, who is a child, may be exhibiting. We are not aware of it. That's why I wanted to mention what are the signs we must look for so that the child can be believed.
So let's talk about that.
Right.
Because it's important that our viewers understand and appreciate how significant this is.
Yes. So if you see a change in behavior in the child, that this child is now quieter and more distant than usual, the child becomes suddenly quiet and is more distant than usual, John. The child is more clingier than usual, particularly in the presence of the abuser. They become more clingier. They don't want to let go from this, whether it's a mom or a dad. There are unusual fears sometimes around. They don't want to be alone, right? They have difficulty concentrating. They kind of zone out. They are distracted. There are issues with their sleeping, with their hygiene.
With their schoolwork.
The person regresses, yes, in their schoolwork and attendance. There are other things, bedwetting, right? And regressing in terms of their behavior. So a 9-year-old may regress to 5-year or 4-year. The sexual themes in their artwork. In fact, in art therapy, some clinical psychologists, as we brought this with, they put something, give the child artwork to do, and likely those are the things that they will draw. They'll probably draw a sexual organ or something that has to do with sexual function.
So that if you're a teacher and you observe that when you give the child an assignment, the child's theme seems consistently to be along a certain line, that should give you some kind of clue, some awareness to say, hey, something is happening here.
Yes. Yeah. There will also be some other thing like acting out behavior that you have not been seen before. The person can be, it can be traumatic type of behaviors. They may throw some temper tantrums and those kind of things. They may have destructive behavior. They may become truant. In the case of boys, they may become aggressive. These are all of the things. They withdraw from friends and families. They show evidence of depression. All these things. Children are people too. And so they show emotions. A child can be depressed. In fact, I have had to deal with is where the child was depressed right in the house and the parents did not even see the symptom of depression. Not one of them they recognized. They just thought that this child was just acting, as we say, foolish, and decided that instead of trying to have a conversation to know what is wrong, they became punitive to corporal punishment because the child was not behaving, not knowing that the child was experiencing this trauma.
I mean, next week we're gonna come back to that next week, but it's again so important that people, parents, individuals who have to do with children. You may not have a child, but you may teach
any form of caregiving
class. It is important that you understand. In fact, I would go as far as saying it is important that a church, in general, given that our congregations are not immune, given that we know that there is, and by the way, we spoke about, earlier on, I shared statistics, 260 a year out of certain things and so on. It is important to know and to say that statistics also suggest that, only about, in some cases, 30% of the people, some less, some people believe as low as 5% of people actually report it. So we say that for every person a predator, a child molester molests, there are 3, 4, 10 others who have not said anything.
Right.
And so the scale, the magnitude of the situation is one that means that churches need to be educated on this subject that we're talking about today.
So not just the parent, but anybody who has to do with the child should be aware and understand what are the symptoms that will present when a child is being abused, right? And I did mention a key one, self-harm, like cutting.
Cutting, yes.
And all, because I've known a case where, and this I'm talking about Seventh Adventist family, where the child, this time it was clinically, you cannot mention where or who, but the child was mutilating, self-mutilating, went into the room and had the knife under her pillow.
Sadly, individuals have tried to commit suicide.
Yes, they have suicidal ideation and I know of a case where the child literally walked into the road, and had it not been for vigilant people into the traffic,
Yes.
she wanted to take her life.
So, friends, again, we are discussing this subject because it is not something that is distant from us. We're not making stories up. These are realities. I mean, last week we made a point that this is still God's church. And we're not confining ourselves to one denomination. We're saying the Christian church is plagued with individuals who are opportunistic. Some individuals believe that if they say they are a Christian, people will not suspect them. I did share that, that interview with some of these priests. And when asked, did you have these tendencies before you went into the priesthood? And some of them responded by saying, it's because we had these tendencies why we went into the priesthood, because nobody would believe that we would do these things. But I want to just, in the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have, Pastor, we're going to raise an issue that we will continue next week, So I want us now to focus on how we can prevent this from happening in the church. You've already shared on some things that parents and caregivers can look for. But as Seventh Adventists, we have taken several steps. But prevention is not automatic, and I want to make that point. Prevention is not automatic. As a church, we have ethical positions. We have published statements where we stand on certain issues. But just publishing a statement to say this is our principle, this is where we stand, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. A couple of weeks ago, I was in a church, and after preaching and was in discussion, with some of the brethren after church, a gentleman walked up to me and he said, listen, in my country, he was visiting, he said, in my country, in Europe, he said, Pastor Greene, what do you think about this? And he said that they are saying in his congregation that anybody who deals with children and some other age category he mentioned have to sign a code of ethics, and he was totally opposed to signing a code of ethics. And his rationale was that, listen, if a person wants to molest a child, they're going to molest a child, irrespective of whether they sign the code, so he didn't see the big deal in it. What's my point? My point is, it is one thing to have documented measures in place. It is another thing to implement them and to monitor to make sure that they've been implemented. I'll come back to this next week. But the church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, has taken very determined and positive steps to prevent, to limit, to avoid child abuse from happening in its ranks. Now, while we are quite clear, as I said before, that, we can't ever be 100% sure that this does not happen. We want to do what we can, and that's one of the reasons why we are bringing this thing to the fore this afternoon. There is a statement, the church has several statements, in fact, and I want to quote from one of them, nurture and what's the name of the statement? It's let me just check to make sure I'm telling you.
It comes out of our
nurture and protection of children.
Yes, we have a child protection policy as Assembly of this church.
Yes.
And as you rightly said, Dr. Greene, sometimes we are careless with the implementation. And I want not just to talk to my community, I would wish that all denominations have such a policy, and not just have the policy written on paper, but is implemented. Our church board should have that policy paper by them when they are choosing people to work with our young people. Because of because of the litigation reasons, as we are seeing in other denominations, and in our situation, it's not litigation, but we're talking about the ascending liability, because whenever this case, I was listening to a lawyer, we were having some kind of workshop dealing with the same thing in the church, and he was saying that a defense lawyer who comes against the church is going to go to see where the deepest pocket is.
Well, of course, that happens all the time.
And that is why
and they're not going to sue the individual.
Yeah.
You know, in fact, not even the local church.
Right.
You know, they're going to the conference, etc.
That's what.
Well, Pastor, our time is just about up. So let me just read the statement. Well, not the statement. I want to read the first half a paragraph, and we're going to pick it up next week. But just so it really begins beautifully by stating our view of children. And perhaps this is a good place for us to close today, because we're going to pick this up next week. It says Seventh-day Adventists place a high value on children.
Yes.
In the light of the Bible, they are seen as precious gifts. They, meaning children, are seen as precious gifts from God, entrusted to the care of parents, family, community of faith, and society at large. Children possess enormous potential for making positive contributions to the church and to society. Attention to their care, protection, and development is extremely important. We're going to unpack this next week. We don't have time to do that this afternoon.
And I would end by saying that they are just younger members of the family of God that we have to protect and to take care of. They are just younger members of the family of God.
That's correct. So friends, we want you, as we close today, we continue next week, and we're asking you, if you are a children's Sabbath school teacher, a children's Sunday school teacher, tell all of your children's division leaders, listen to Let's Talk next week. If you work with children, with young people, if you know teachers in your school, tell them that what we're discussing next week is something they need to hear. That's all the time we have for today. May God bless you, and see you next week.